The blood on her porch boards was still warm when Minnie Ralston pressed her lantern close to the face of the man who had collapsed against her door, and she could not decide in that first breathless moment whether she was looking at a dead man or merely one who wished he were. The wind off the Kansas plain carried September cold with it, rolling down from the north in long, invisible waves that bent the dry grass flat and rattled the shutters of the small Ralston homestead. It was 1882, and the territory around Caldwell was the kind of country that chewed men up without apology. Minnie knew that better than most. She had buried a husband in this ground 17 months ago, and the earth here took what it wanted without ever asking permission. She crouched lower, holding the lantern steady despite the trembling in her wrist. The man was broad through the shoulders, his canvas duster torn at the side where something, a bullet, she suspected, had opened a gash along his ribs. His hat had rolled off somewhere in the dark yard behind him. His hair was dark brown and damp against his forehead, and there was a cut above his left eye that had sent a dried ribbon of blood down past his temple and across his jaw. He was breathing. Shallow, but breathing. "Lord Almighty," Minnie whispered to no one. She straightened up and looked out at the darkness beyond the fence line. The prairie was black and enormous. Whatever had happened to this man had happened out there somewhere, and she could not see any evidence that it was going to come walking toward her porch. No hoofbeats, no lanterns swinging in the distance, just the wind and the grass and the cold. She made her decision the way she had learned to make most decisions since Robert died, quickly, practically, and without room for second guessing. She gripped the man under both arms and pulled. He was heavy. Solidly, inconveniently heavy, the way a man is when all of him is muscle and none of it is helping. Minnie dragged him across the threshold by sheer stubbornness, her boot heels digging into the wood, her breath coming in hard bursts. She got him to the rug in front of the stove and let him down as gently as she could manage, which was not very gently at all. He made a sound when his back hit the floor, a low groan that told her he was closer to consciousness than she had thought. "Stay still," she told him, as though he had any choice. She worked fast, cutting away the duster and the shirt beneath it with her good shears to get at the wound on his ribs. It was a bullet graze, deep enough to have bled badly but not deep enough to have gone into the body cavity. She had seen worse on cattle after a branding gone wrong, though she was careful not to say that to the man. She cleaned the wound with the whiskey she kept for exactly these kinds of emergencies, packed it with clean cloth, and wrapped his torso in strips of sheeting that she tore from the oldest linens in the chest at the foot of her bed. She worked on the cut above his eye next, stitching it closed with the small curved needle and fine thread she used for mending leather. 3 stitches. His eyelids flickered when the needle went in, but he did not wake. She sat back on her heels when she was done and looked at him properly for the first time since she had dragged him through the door. He was somewhere around 30, she guessed, maybe a year or two either side of that. His face was weathered in the way that all outdoor men's faces were weathered in this country, the sun having had its full say about his skin, but it was not a rough or brutal face. There was something almost careful about his features, a kind of precision to the jaw and the brow that made her think, for a reason she could not entirely name, of a man who was used to paying close attention to things. His hands, which she had moved while tending to him, were calloused but not scarred the way a brawler's hands would be scarred. There was a holster on his right hip, and she had noticed when she moved his duster that the holster was worn in the particular way that came from daily use, not occasional use. She removed his gun belt and hung it on the peg by the door, then pulled the quilts from the cedar chest and covered him to his chin. He slept for 2 days. Minnie kept the farm going around him. She had 40 acres and a small herd, 9 cattle, 2 horses, a scattering of chickens, and 1 pig named Cornelius who she refused to acknowledge had a name. She hauled water, fed the animals, mended the fence on the east side where a post had been leaning since July, and cooked her meals for one with the quiet efficiency of a woman long accustomed to her own company. Every few hours she checked on the stranger. His fever climbed on the first night, and she sat up with him, pressing cold cloths to his forehead and his neck, watching the fire. She talked to him the way she sometimes talked to the horses, calmly and without expecting an answer, just the sound of a human voice filling the silence. "I don't know who you are," she said at one point in the deep of the night, while the fire crackled and the wind pressed at the walls. "But you are not dying in my front room. I will not permit it." He broke the fever by morning of the second day. She was in the kitchen when she heard the sound, not a groan this time, but the deliberate, careful shifting of a man who was testing whether his body would obey him. She came to the doorway and found him sitting up on the floor, the quilts pooled around his waist, one hand pressed to his bandaged ribs and his eyes open. He had very dark eyes. She noticed that first. The color of strong coffee, watchful and serious. "Good morning," Minnie said, because it seemed like the right thing to say. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him assembling himself, pulling the pieces of his situation together and deciding what to do about them. "Good morning," he said. His voice was low and a little rough from disuse, but steady. "I am in your home." "You are. I came to your porch." "You did. You were in a bad way." He looked down at the bandages around his ribs and then up at the stitches she had put above his eye, which he seemed to locate by the pull of the thread against his skin. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see something careful moving behind his eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for the doctoring. Do you need water?" "Yes, please." She brought him a tin cup and a glass of water and crouched down to hand them to him, watching him drink. He drank the whole glass slowly, like a man exercising restraint over what he actually wanted to do, which was probably drain everything she had in the house. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked. He looked at the empty glass. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite categorize, not deception, exactly, but not full openness either. A door that was mostly closed. "Isaiah," he said. "Isaiah Shelby, Minnie Ralston." She offered her hand out of habit, and he shook it. His grip was firm but careful, like he was aware of the difference between his strength and hers. "What happened to you, Mr. Shelby?" "Ran into some trouble on the Kishom Road," he said. "I would rather not trouble you with the particulars." "The particulars are already in my front room," she said mildly. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the precursor of one. "Fair point. 3 men jumped me about 5 miles east of here. I managed to get to my horse, but the horse threw me somewhere in the dark. I walked until I saw your light." "What did these men want?" "My horse," he said, "and whatever else I had." It was a plain enough answer, and common enough in this stretch of Kansas. Road agents and thieves were not rare, but she noticed that he had answered exactly what she asked and nothing more, and that the space around his words was carefully maintained. She did not press it. "You should not try to get up today," she said. "Your ribs are grazed, but the wound is clean, and I want it to stay that way. The fever broke this morning, which is good, but you lost a fair amount of blood." "I've lost blood before," he said, "and I've had to clean it off my porch before," she replied. "So we understand each other." He looked at her with something new in his expression now, a kind of appreciation, she thought, as though he had expected something more fragile and found something else entirely. "Yes, ma'am, we do." "You can have the cot in the back room," she said, standing. "Once you're able to stand. For now, the floor will have to do. I'll bring you breakfast." She made him eggs and cornbread and a pot of strong coffee, and he ate everything with the focused intensity of a man who had not eaten in days, which was likely true. He thanked her again, quietly and with his eyes level on hers, and she had the sense that this was a man who did not thank people easily or automatically, that the words carried actual weight with him when he said them. She set up the small back room for him that afternoon, the room that had been Robert's study and still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old leather. There was a cot in there, and a washstand and a window that looked out toward the eastern pasture. Isaiah Shelby made his way to it with careful steps, one hand brushing the wall, his face giving nothing away about how much the movement cost him. She had offered her arm, and he had taken it without fuss, without embarrassment or false pride, which she respected. He slept again for the rest of that day and through the night, and when she checked on him in the morning she found him already awake, sitting up on the cot with his back against the wall, looking out the window at the pale gold of the early pasture. His expression was quiet and remote, like a man who had spent a great deal of time inside his own thoughts and was comfortable there. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Enough," he said. "I'm going to look at the wound this morning. Can I do that?" Yes, the wound was healing cleanly. She unwrapped the bandages and examined it with the careful attention she gave to every practical task, then cleaned it and rewrapped it. He sat still and let her work, and she was aware of the warmth of him beneath her hands, the solid reality of another person in this house that had been just her for so long. "You don't have family nearby," he said, not a question. "No," she said. "My husband passed 17 months ago. I have a neighbor, Walt Decker, 3 miles north. He checks on me when he thinks to. You've been running this place alone for 17 months. Yes." He was quiet, and she got the sense he was resettling something in his thinking about her. "That's a hard piece of work," he said finally. "Most honest work is," she said. Over the following days he began to mend in earnest. The fever was fully gone and the wound showed no signs of infection. He moved more easily each day, adding small efforts to his routine, carrying his own water pitcher to the washstand, helping her bring wood to the porch when she brought the morning load, insisting on feeding the horses when she told him the horses were perfectly capable of waiting. "I've been lying down for 5 days," he said on that 4th morning, already at the barn door with a bucket of oats. "If I lie down any longer I will go to pieces. You'll pull that wound open." "I will be careful," she let him, partly because she had the sense that arguing with Isaiah Shelby once he had decided on a course was not a productive use of anyone's morning, but partly also, and she admitted this to herself with a small, wry honesty, because it was genuinely useful to have someone else working alongside her. The farm had 100 small demands that never stopped regardless of what else was happening, and having another pair of hands made the days easier in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. He was good with animals. She noticed that. The horses, which were sometimes skittish with strangers, settled quickly under his hands. He talked to them in the same low, unhurried way that she did, and he paid attention to what they communicated back in the way they moved their ears and shifted their weight. He carried himself around the animals without aggression or impatience, and they responded to it. He was also useful. He fixed the leaning fence post on the east side without being asked, simply appearing at supper one evening with mud on his hands and knees, and reporting that it was done. He patched a gap in the barn roof where rain had been getting in. He found a weak link in the water pump chain that she had not noticed and replaced it with wire from the tool shed. "You've been busy," she said one evening, watching him wash his hands at the pump in the yard. "I don't do well idle," he said. "Neither do I," she paused. "We have that in common." He looked up at her over his wet hands, and the evening light was doing something remarkable to the color of his eyes, turning them warm and gold-edged. "I believe we have a few things in common," he said. She went inside before her expression could say anything she was not ready to say out loud. The evenings were when she came to know him best. They fell into a routine without either of them deciding to supper at the table together, then coffee by the stove while the night gathered against the windows, and the kind of conversation that starts with practical matters and gradually, over days, opens itself toward something more honest and more real. She learned that he was from Missouri, that he had served in the war as a young man, that he had no family living that he was aware of. He spoke about the war the way men of his generation tended to speak about it briefly, obliquely, with long pauses that contained more than the words did. She did not push. She had known enough veterans to know that some things were not meant to be pulled out of their containers. He learned that she had come to Kansas with Robert from Ohio in 1877, that they had built the house themselves with help from Walt Decker and a few other neighbors, that she had wanted children, but the Lord had not seen fit to send them yet, and that she had been considering whether to sell the farm when Robert died, and had decided against it out of stubbornness more than sense. "I don't think it was stubbornness," Isaiah said one evening. He was holding his coffee cup in both hands, his eyes on the fire. "I think it was the right call. You're kind to say so." "I'm not being kind," he said. "Kindness would be agreeing with you to make you feel better. I think this land suits you. I think leaving it would have been wrong." Minnie looked at him over her own cup. "You've known me for 10 days, she said. "Some people you can read fast," he said simply. "And what have you read?" He looked at her then, directly, without evasion. "A woman who is more comfortable with a hammer and a bucket than with uselessness. A woman who keeps her grief organized and her kitchen orderly and her heart fairly well defended. A woman who dragged a bleeding stranger off her porch and sewed him up without panicking." He paused. "That kind of woman does not do well anywhere but here." Minnie was quiet for a moment. Her throat was doing something inconvenient. "I didn't realize I was so transparent," she said. "You're not transparent," he said. "I'm just paying attention." She looked at the fire instead of at him because the fire was safer. "What should I read about you, Mr. Shelby?" she asked. "Not much to read," he said. "I'm nobody in particular, just a man who was heading somewhere and got turned around." "Everybody is somebody in particular," she said. "That's just what you say when you don't want to be asked about it." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it had weight in it. She felt him make some internal choice she was not privy to, settling into something, deciding something. But when he spoke again, it was only to say that he ought to turn in, that his ribs were tight, and she let it be. The days stretched and warmed slightly as September softened its edges. Isaiah's wound had healed to a clean scar, and he moved without restriction now. The hunched, careful way of the early days replaced by his natural gait, which was long-strided and economical, the walk of a man who covered a great deal of ground in a day and did not waste motion doing it. She caught herself watching him cross the yard sometimes with a kind of idle interest that she then immediately redirected toward whatever task she was supposed to be doing. She was not a woman who pretended to herself. She had been raised by a plain-spoken Ohio woman who had believed the cardinal sin was self-deception, and that principle had settled into Minnie's bones. So when she noticed that she looked forward to supper in a way she had not looked forward to it since Robert was alive, she acknowledged it plainly to herself, without drama or panic. When she noticed that she paid slightly more attention to her hair on mornings when Isaiah would be around, she acknowledged that too. She filed these observations away under the heading of things that required careful thought, and she gave them that thought, patiently, the way she gave thought to every complex problem she encountered. Isaiah was still a stranger in important ways. She knew the surface of him but not the depth. She knew he was capable and careful and decent, that he had a dry humor that surfaced unexpectedly and delighted her when it did, that he was kind to animals and respectful of her space and genuinely useful around the farm. But there was a part of him, a significant, central part that remained closed to her. The past he did not discuss. The destination he had been riding toward before the road agent stopped him. The wariness that lived in him, always present, even in his most relaxed moments like a watchman who never fully slept. She told herself she was not entitled to those things. He was a guest, not a husband. Whatever was closed in him was his by right, but the wondering stayed with her. It was on a Thursday morning, the middle of September, when she found it. She had gone into the back room to strip the linens for washing, moving quickly and efficiently as she always did, pulling the sheets from the cot and gathering them up. Isaiah was out at the barn. She was crossing the room toward the door when the leather saddlebag on the floor by the washstand shifted as she brushed it with her foot, and something slid out of the unbuckled front pocket and clinked against the floorboard. She stopped. She looked down. It was a badge. Heavy, round stamped metal, the kind with a pin on the back, lying face up on her floorboard. She could read the words without picking it up. United States Deputy Marshal. She stood very still for a moment, holding the sheets against her chest, looking at the badge. She felt the shape of the last 2 weeks rearrange itself slightly, like a drawing that looks like one thing until you tilt it and see the other picture inside it. The holster worn smooth with daily use. The way he watched the road when they stood together at the fence line. The precise economy of a man who was always situationally aware. The 3 men on the Kisham Road who had wanted his horse and whatever else he had. Road agents did not typically organize to take down a single traveling man over a horse, but they would organize over a lawman. She heard his footsteps on the porch. She had the sheets bunched against her, the badge on the floor between her and the door. She heard him come through the front, heard his boots in the kitchen, and then he appeared in the back room doorway. He saw her face first. Then he looked down at the floor and saw the badge. The silence that happened between them in that moment was enormous and specific, the kind of silence that has the shape of a particular thing and not nothing. Isaiah Shelby looked at the badge for a long moment. Then he looked at her. His face was entirely still, but she could see something happening behind his eyes, some honest reckoning with a thing he had been managing carefully and now no longer could. "I told you I was nobody," he said. "You did," she said. "I believed you for almost 2 weeks." "Minnie," he said her name like he was picking it up gently, being careful with it. "You could have told me," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I know," he said. He came into the room, his hat in his hands, and crouched down to pick up the badge. He held it in his palm for a moment and then looked at her. "I'm a deputy U.S. Marshal out of Wichita. I was writing a case. There's a man called Holt Darrow, who's been running a protection ring along the Kishom corridor. Threatening ranchers, burning property, worse. The men who came at me on the road were Darrows. They knew who I was. That's why you didn't want to tell me." "Partly," he said. He stood, turning the badge over in his fingers. "And partly because it is easier sometimes to be nobody, to just be a man that a woman let in from the cold and fed and patched up, to just be that without the rest of it for a little while." She put the sheets down on the cot and sat on the edge of the mattress looking at him. "How long have you been a marshal?" she asked. 6 years. "Is that what takes you away from having anywhere to stay, anywhere to be?" He looked at her with the kind of attention that felt like a touch. "Yes," he said, "mostly." He was quiet for a moment. "There were things before it too," he said. "The war, after the war, I was not always settled. I didn't know how to be still for a long time. The badge gave me somewhere to put that. Something to do with the part of me that can't stop watching, can't stop moving." He paused. "It's good work. I believe in it. But it is not a life that sits still anywhere." "Is that what you want?" she asked. "A life that sits still." He looked at her for a long moment, and the morning light through the east window was full on his face, and she could see everything in him in that moment. The tiredness and the watchfulness and the thing underneath those that was neither tired nor weary. The thing that had been sitting across the table from her every evening for 2 weeks and looking at her like she was the most interesting landscape he had ever encountered. "I don't know what I want," he said honestly. "I haven't known for a long time. This is the closest I've come to knowing in quite a while." She held his gaze. The thumping in her chest was steady and specific. "You should have told me," she said again, but the heat had gone out of it. What was left was just the plain truth of it. "Yes," he said, "I should have." There was a long pause. Minnie looked at her hands in her lap. "Will those men come back?" she asked. "Darrow's men?" "Possibly," he said. He said it honestly, without softening it, which she appreciated more than she could say. "I need to send word to the marshal's office in Wichita. There's a telegraph in Caldwell, which is 8 miles, she said. "I'll write it today." "I'll come with you," she said. He looked at her with mild surprise. "I need flour and lamp oil," she said, by way of explanation, because it was true. But they both knew it was not the whole truth. They rode to Caldwell together on the 2 horses, side by side along the road, the September sky enormous above them, blue in the way that Kansas sky was blue in autumn, that specific vast clean blue that felt like it went all the way up to somewhere that did not have a name. They did not talk much on the road, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of 2 people being careful around each other. It was the silence of two people who had said something real and were giving it room to settle. Caldwell in 1882 was a cattle town with hard edges. The Kishom Trail still ran through it, though the cattle traffic had been declining in recent years as the railheads moved and the range was fenced further south. But there was still a commerce to it: dry goods stores and a hardware, a hotel, a saloon, a telegraph office, a church at the north end of Main Street that looked like it had been put there as a kind of argument against the saloon. Minnie went to the mercantile while Isaiah went to the telegraph office, and she bought her flour and lamp oil and a tin of molasses and a paper of pins and a new cake of soap that smelled like lavender, which she put in the basket quickly before she could think about why she had chosen it. She was loading her purchases into the saddlebag when she heard her name, Minnie Ralston. She turned to find Walt Decker coming across the street toward her, his gray hat pushed back on his head in the way he always wore it, his face creased with the particular concern of a man who has been thinking worried thoughts for several days. "Walt," she said warmly, "I've been meaning to ride up and see you." "I came by your place 3 days ago," he said. "Saw smoke and figured you were well, but there was a horse in your barn I didn't recognize." He said it neutrally, but she could see the question in it. "I have a guest," she said. "A man came to my door injured a couple weeks back. I've been tending him." Walt looked at her steadily. He was 62, a widower himself, and he had been looking out for her since Robert died with the plain, practical kindness of a neighbor who understood what it meant to be alone in this country. "Who is he?" he asked. "His name is Isaiah Shelby. He's a deputy U.S. marshal out of Wichita. He was set upon on the Kishom Road and made his way to my door." Walt absorbed this. "A lawman," he said. "Yes. Is he decent?" "He is," she said, and she said it without qualification, and something about the way she said it made Walt Decker look at her with a new attention and then slowly nod. "All right then," he said. "You'll tell me if you need anything." "I always do." She found Isaiah coming out of the telegraph office when she crossed back to the far side of the street. He was reading a telegram that had been waiting for him there, his face composed but his eyes moving quickly over the paper. He folded it when he saw her coming. "News?" she asked. "Darrow has pushed further north than we thought," he said. "He's been working ranches between here and Wichita. The marshal's office wants me to make contact with a rancher named Phineas Cole, about 4 miles east of here. He's been filing complaints, and he may have information about Darrow's operation." Minnie looked at him. The slight tightening around his mouth, the way his attention had sharpened into working focus. She recognized this in him now, the shift into the other self, the one with the badge in his pocket instead of on the floor. "When do you need to go?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning would be sensible," he said. "If that—" he stopped, reconsidered. "I know I've imposed on you long enough as it is, Minnie. I can find a room in Caldwell for tonight." "You can come back and have supper first," she said, "and then we'll see." He looked at her with something grateful and undefended in his face, and she held it for a moment, that look, the specific quality of it, before turning to her horse. They rode back in the later afternoon, and she made a supper of good beef stew with the dried herbs from her windowsill bundles and the fresh bread she had started that morning, and they ate together in the warm kitchen, while the sky outside turned amber and then purple. He told her more about the case, Darrow's pattern of intimidation, the way he used fear to extract protection payments from ranchers along the cattle routes, the violence that followed those who refused. He told her about the 2 ranching families who had lost their barns, about a family near Kiowa who had packed their things and left rather than face another threat. "That's the injustice of it," Minnie said. "That good people have to leave the land they built because the law can't reach fast enough." "I know," Isaiah said. "It's the thing that keeps me riding." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his bowl. "There are people in this territory who have no recourse, people who came here with nothing and built something and have no one to stand between them and men like Darrow. That's what the badge is supposed to be for." "Is it enough?" she asked. "One man with a badge. It has to be enough," he said. "Until there are more of us. And there are more of us," It's just that the territory is wide and the bad actors are opportunistic, and we are always playing catch. Robert used to say this land would sort itself out eventually, she said. That civilization follows settlement. Robert sounds like a thoughtful man. He was, she said. He was a very good man. She paused, feeling the familiar ache of it, not sharp anymore, not the way it had been at first, but present, like a scar that remembers itself in cold weather. He would have liked you, I think. He had a great deal of respect for practical men who believed in something. Isaiah looked at her across the table. He sounds like a hard man to follow, he said. I'm not asking anyone to follow him, she said. And then she held her breath slightly, because that was a more direct thing than she had intended to say, and it landed in the space between them with all its implications fully intact. Isaiah set down his fork. He looked at her for a long moment. That careful, attentive, fully present look that she had come to understand was his most honest face, the one he showed when he was not managing anything or measuring anything, just actually there. Minnie, he said, I want to say something to you, and I want to say it honestly. I would expect nothing less, she said. I have been thinking about how to leave here for 3 days, he said. Not because I want to, because I think I ought to. Because I came to your porch and imposed on your life, and I am conscious of the fact that this situation is, he stopped and found better words. I am conscious of the fact that you are a woman alone and that I have no right to complicate what you've built here. You're not complicating anything, she said. I am a little, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. I think you know that. I might know that, she conceded. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on the table, his hands open in front of him. I'm going to ride to the coal ranch tomorrow and do the work I came here to do, he said. I don't know how long the Darrow matter will take. It could be days or it could be longer, but I'd like to, he stopped again, started more carefully. I would like to come back when it's done, if you'll have me, not as a patient and not as a man making repairs, as a man who would like to sit across this table and talk to you for a good long while and find out what comes of it, if that's something you want. Minnie Ralston looked at this man, this careful, honest, complicated, decent man with the marshal's badge in his pocket, and the watchfulness in his eyes, and the steady way he had of making her feel seen. And she felt something open in her chest that she had kept very carefully closed for 17 months. Come back when it's done, she said. I'll have supper on. He rode out the next morning before full light, and she stood at the porch in the cold and watched him go, and she did not allow herself to feel anxious about it because anxiety was not useful. She turned back to her work and her days, and she made them count, but she watched the road more than she usually did. Walt Decker came by 2 days later, and she told him the truth of it, or enough of it anyway, that Isaiah was working a case. That he would be back. Walt listened with his usual quiet attention and then said, That fellow fixed your east fence post, which was not exactly a response but was, in Walt's particular language, an approval. He did, Minnie said. Good with horses too, from what I saw. He is. Walt nodded and drank his coffee and said no more about it, which was Walt's way of saying everything was fine. On the 5th day after Isaiah rode east, she was in the kitchen in the early afternoon when she heard a horse on the road and felt her pulse do something unauthorized. She went to the window and looked out, and it was him coming up the road at a walk, the duster dusty, the set of his shoulders suggesting a tiredness that went down through the bone. She had coffee on the stove before he reached the porch. He came through the door and hung his hat and his gun belt and looked at her, and the whole 5 days were in his face, the work and the danger and the wearing tedium of it, but he was intact, which was all she needed to know. Darrow, she said. Under arrest, he said. Cole had the evidence we needed. Between what Cole provided and what the other ranchers were willing to sign to, the federal prosecutor will have more than enough. He sat down at the table with the looseness of a man whose joints have decided to stop cooperating. Cole is a good man. His family 3 daughters and a son and a wife who makes the best cornbread I have ever eaten, with all due respect to your own. High praise, Minnie said, setting coffee in front of him. His son rides well, Isaiah said. "Boy of about 16. Smart kid. Cole said he wants to be a lawman when he comes of age." He picked up the coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at her over the rim. "I told him it was good work if he meant it." "Do you think he meant it?" "Yes," Isaiah said. "The good ones always mean it." He drank the coffee slowly and she sat across from him, and outside the window the afternoon was golden and the cattle were moving slowly in the pasture, and Cornelius the pig was doing something noisy in his pen that she was going to have to investigate later. "I meant what I said before I left," Isaiah said. He set the cup down and looked at her squarely. "I would like to stay for a while, Minnie, if you'll have me." "How long is a while?" she asked. "I have leave coming," he said. 30 days. "Maybe more if I put the request in properly." He paused. "I've been thinking on the road about what comes after the leave, about what the rest of this looks like. I don't want to promise you something I haven't worked out yet because you deserve better than half-made promises, but I know I want to stay. I know this place." He stopped. Then more quietly, "I know you are the most compelling reason to stop moving that I have encountered in my adult life. And I've been moving since I was 17 years old." Minnie held his gaze. 30 days is a reasonable start," she said. He nodded once, and the weight that had been sitting in him seemed to ease slightly, the watchman behind his eyes relaxing in the particular way that happened when the thing he had been watching for turned out to be safe. "Now eat something," she said. "You look like you've been living on hardtack." "Mostly," he admitted. "Cornbread is on the counter." The 30 days unfolded with the richness of good, full-time days that were not wasted and not waited through, but actually lived. They worked the farm together in the mornings and talked through the afternoons and spent their evenings by the stove. And Minnie came to know Isaiah Shelby the way you only know someone when you see them in all the ordinary textures of a day, not just in the interesting moments. She knew that he woke early and lay still for several minutes before getting up, listening to the world outside sort itself out. She knew that he was methodical about tool care in a way that impressed her, every nail set back in the right jar, every blade hung point down. She knew that he was patient with things that resisted him, a stubborn bolt, a reluctant post hole, a chicken that kept getting through the fence, patient in a way that was not passive but attentive, the patience of a man who trusted that most problems yielded eventually to steady work. She also knew that he was lonely. Not in a way he would ever say or perhaps even fully recognize in himself, but in the way that was visible in moments of stillness, a kind of surprise at the warmth of the house, a particular quality of attention when she talked, as though each thing she said was being stored carefully. She recognized that loneliness because she had been carrying her own version of it for 17 months, and she knew its shape. On a Sunday afternoon in late September, they rode together to Caldwell for the church service that she attended when she could manage the trip. She had not thought to warn him about the church and was slightly abashed when it became clear that he had not attended one in some years. But he sat beside her in the plain wooden pew with the same steady presence he brought to everything, and sang the hymns in a low, careful voice that was not perfectly on pitch but was entirely sincere. And afterward he shook hands with the minister, Reverend Hanscombe, who was a serious man with kind eyes and a strong handshake. With the respectful directness that characterized everything Isaiah did in the world. Walt Decker was there, sitting 2 rows forward. He turned around once during the service and looked at the two of them sitting together, and turned back around with the expression of a man who has confirmed a conclusion he had already reached. After the service, in the yard outside the church, the small Caldwell community gathered in the informal way that church communities did in cattle towns, women talking across children's heads, men discussing cattle prices and the weather, the ordinary fabric of a settled life being maintained against the backdrop of a country that was still very much unsettled. There were hard things visible in that yard if you looked for them. Women with tired faces and work-worn hands, men with the tight expressions of people whose margins were slim, a Comanche man who stood near the fence at the edge of the yard, watching, not part of the gathering but not excluded from it. And Minnie knew him slightly, knew he had worked a ranch south of Caldwell until the ranch changed hands and the new owner had no interest in keeping him on. She had spoken to him before, briefly, at the mercantile. His name was Three Deer, and he was a capable man in a precarious situation, one of many native men navigating the shrinking, brutal reality of what the territory's settlement meant for his people, the reservations, the displacement, the careful daily negotiations of survival in a world that was being taken from them piece by piece. She greeted him at the fence, and he acknowledged her with a nod and a cautious civility. She introduced Isaiah, who shook his hand without hesitation and spoke to him the way he spoke to everyone, directly and with full attention, and she noticed Three Deer's slight surprise at this, the small recalibration of a man who was accustomed to being looked past. On the ride home, she mentioned it to Isaiah, the ranch owner who had let him go, the general condition of the native men in the territory, caught between the old world and the new one, both of which were being closed to them simultaneously. Isaiah was quiet for a while. Then, "I've seen it all along the trail corridors," he said. "The law as it exists is mostly pointed at protecting property rights of settlers. It does not much concern itself with what was here before the settlers arrived." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words carefully. "I've made some noise about it internally in the marshal's office. I don't know that it has done much. The machinery is what it is." Another pause, shorter. "That doesn't mean the right answer is to accept it." "No," she said, "it does not." He looked at her sideways on the road, and she could see the respect in his face, warm and uncomplicated, the respect of a man who is consistently pleased to find that the person he is becoming attached to sees the world clearly. "You are a complicated woman, Minnie Ralston," he said. "I am a simple woman who reads the world honestly," she replied. Those two things look the same from some angles. He laughed at that, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not heard from him before. It transformed his face, opening it up, removing the last traces of reserve, and she filed it away with the care she gave to important things. The nights grew colder through October. She noticed when she made her morning rounds that the leaves on the cottonwood trees by the creek had turned yellow and were thinning, and the grass had gone a pale tawny gold that was beautiful and sorrowful in equal measure. The cattle grew their winter coats. The chickens grew difficult about laying. Cornelius the pig became aggressively interested in the kitchen door, which he always did when the cold came. Isaiah had written to the marshal's office for extended leave and received it. He had written again, and she knew from the look on his face when he came back from Caldwell with the reply that it was a more substantive communication than a simple leave extension. He did not immediately tell her what it said, and she did not ask, because she had come to trust that he would tell her when he had sorted through it himself. He told her on a Tuesday evening, sitting across from her at the table with his coffee cup and the letter folded in front of him. "They've offered me a position based in Caldwell," he said. "Resident deputy working the Caldwell-Wellington corridor. It would be a fixed post, not itinerant." He looked at the letter. "I've been a riding marshal for 6 years. This would be different, stationary, predictable hours and a regular salary and a place to be between cases." Minnie looked at him steadily. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking," he said carefully, "that this is the kind of position that would allow a man to have roots." He met her eyes, to plant something, to have somewhere that is his and someone. He stopped. "I want to say what I mean clearly." "Please," she said. "I am in love with you," Isaiah Shelby said. He said it simply, without adornment, with the directness he brought to everything important. "I know that may be faster than you're comfortable with. I know I came to your door a stranger, and I am aware of all the ways that is a complicated beginning. But I have been honest with you about everything else, and I will not be anything other than honest about this. I am in love with you. I would like to accept this position, and I would like to court you properly, and in whatever time feels right to you, I would like to ask you to marry me." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a night bird called once and then was still. The fire settled in the stove with a soft sound. Minnie looked at Isaiah Shelby, this man who had come to her porch with someone else's bullet in his side and his badge in his pocket and his honest, watchful eyes, and she felt the thing that had been opening in her chest for weeks now open the rest of the way, fully, like a door that had finally made up its mind. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I believe I have been for some time and have been being sensible about it, which I now think was unnecessary." He looked at her with an expression that she could only describe as overwhelmed, the expression of a man who has been braced for a harder answer and is now recalibrating to a better one. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and his hand was warm and steadied against her fingers, and she turned her palm up to hold it. "I would like you to court me," she said. "I would like it to be done in a way that Walt Decker approves of because Walt will be watching. And I would like you to speak to Reverend Hanscom about the banns when you are ready to ask the question properly." "Yes," he said. "To all of it. Yes." She squeezed his hand once firmly, and then said, "The coffee is getting cold," because she needed something practical to do before she got entirely overwhelmed by her own feelings. He laughed at her again, that unguarded, transforming laugh, and released her hand so she could refill his cup. He accepted the position in Caldwell the following week, writing to the marshal's office in Wichita with his answer, and receiving back a formal commission by return post. He would start formally in January, which gave him time to be of use on the farm through the autumn and to establish himself in the town. Minnie found that she had very specific feelings about the fact that Caldwell was 8 miles away and not 80, feelings she did not particularly try to suppress. He courted her as he did everything with focus and genuine intent and no wasted motion. He brought her things when he rode to Caldwell, small deliberate things. A book of poetry that he admitted he had spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing. A length of blue calico that matched a remark she had made weeks ago about needing to replace a worn dress. A jar of particularly good apple preserves from the mercantile that had come up from Wichita. He asked her opinion on things and listened to her answers with the full weight of his attention, and he gave her his opinions in return with the same directness he always had, never softening a view to please her, which she valued above nearly everything else. Walt Decker came for Sunday supper one evening in October, and afterward, when Minnie was clearing the table, she could hear the low murmur of Walt and Isaiah talking in the front room, the particular tone of two men having a serious conversation. When she came through with the coffee pot, they both looked up at her with the slight self-consciousness of men who have been discussing a woman in her own house, and she set the pot on the table and said, "Whatever you're planning, Walt, be aware that I will hear about it." And Walt had the grace to look caught out. After Walt rode home in the dark, Isaiah came to stand beside her on the porch, where she was watching the stars come out over the flat black line of the horizon. "He's a good man," Isaiah said. "He is one of the best men I know," she said. "He looked after me when I needed looking after, and he has never once made me feel diminished by needing it." "He approves," Isaiah said. "I know," she said. "I heard the tone of it." He stood beside her in the dark and the cold, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his sleeve against her arm, and after a moment she turned slightly into him and he put his arm around her shoulders, his hand warm at her arm, and they stood together in the dark prairie night and looked at the enormous sky. "This is a beautiful place," he said quietly. "I didn't see it when I first came. I was too busy being injured and then too busy being practical, but I see it now." "It grows on you," she said. "Some things are worth the growing time," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder briefly and felt him still beneath the touch and then settle, his arm drawing her incrementally closer. They were married on the second Saturday of December, 1882, in the plain white church on the north end of Main Street in Caldwell. Reverend Hanscom performed the ceremony. Walt Decker stood up with Isaiah on one side. The mercantile owner's wife, Clara Briggs, stood with Minnie on the other. The church was not full. There were perhaps 40 people gathered on a cold December morning, the town's year-round residents, the few ranching families from the surrounding land, but it was warm with bodies and with the particular communal feeling of a place that has gathered to witness something genuine. Minnie wore the blue calico dress she had made from the cloth Isaiah had brought her, with a white collar and her good boots. She had arranged her dark hair up with pins and left a few curls loose at her temples, and when she came down the aisle toward him and saw his face, that face she had come to know better than almost any face she had ever known, with all its careful attention and its hidden humor and its absolute, unwavering honesty. She felt something lock into place inside her with the quiet certainty of a thing that had always been going to happen. He looked at her like she was the entire answer to a question he had been carrying for years. He said his vows in the low, steady voice she had come to love, and she said hers back to him, and Reverend Hanscom pronounced them married, and Walt Decker cleared his throat loudly from the front pew, which was Walt's way of expressing emotion. They had a supper afterward at the Caldwell Hotel, 10 of them around a long table, and there was good beef and fresh bread, and a cake that Clara Briggs had baked, and 3 bottles of decent wine that Isaiah had somehow procured, and the conversation was warm and easy and full of the particular pleasure of people who like each other eating good food together. Walt told a story about Robert building the house on the Ralston homestead that made Minnie laugh until her eyes watered, and made Isaiah listen with the respectful attention he gave to everything about her history, honoring it rather than being threatened by it. When they rode home together in the cold December dark, the stars overhead were extraordinary, the winter sky having cleared to a perfect blackness that made the Milky Way visible as a sweep of faint light from horizon to horizon. "Mrs. Shelby," Isaiah said. "Mr. Shelby," she replied. He reached across the small space between the horses and took her gloved hand in his, and she held it, and they rode the 8 miles home that way, in the cold and the dark, under the vast Kansas sky. The homestead looked different when they came up the road to it, or perhaps she was seeing it differently, the way you see everything differently when you have crossed a threshold. The lamplight in the window she had left burning, the dark bulk of the barn, the fence lined silver in the moonlight. The whole small, particular world of it. Inside, the house was warm from the banked stove, and it smelled of coffee and cedar, and the faint lavender of the soap she bought herself at the Caldwell Mercantile now and again. Isaiah hung his coat and her coat on the pegs and turned to her in the lamplight, and she looked up at him, and the wedding day fell away like a costume, and it was just the 2 of them, the way it had been all these weeks, except entirely different. He kissed her for the first time standing in the front room of her house, their house, his hands at her face, careful and certain, and she held onto the lapels of his shirt and kissed him back. The winter settled over the Kansas prairie with its usual blunt authority. The cattle required extra care in the cold, and the water pump needed to be coaxed free of ice every morning, and the snow when it came lay flat and white and absolute across the land as far as you could see. But the house was warm, and there were 2 people in it, and the evenings were full of the specific richness that a shared domestic life produces when both people in it are paying attention to what they have been given. Isaiah took up his post as resident deputy in Caldwell in January, riding the 8 miles each morning and returning in the evenings, or staying in the small room the town had arranged for deputies when the work ran long or the weather made the road impassable. He came home on those nights to find supper kept warm on the stove and Minnie reading by the lamp, or mending by the fire, or occasionally already asleep, in which case he would come in quietly and bank the stove and remove his boots with the careful soundlessness of a man who has lived alone and knows how not to disturb things. On those mornings when she woke to find him already there, already making coffee in the gray pre-dawn, she would come to the kitchen doorway in her wrapper and look at him and feel the particular settled happiness of it, the reality and the ordinariness and the beauty of it, and think, here is where I am. He was a good lawman in Caldwell. The town had needed a steady presence for years. Not the theatrical, frontier drama kind of lawman that the dime novels described, but the practical, consistent, hard-working kind that actually reduced the ambient threat level of a place by showing up every day and doing the job. He built relationships with the saloon owners and the hotel and the merchants. He kept clear records of incidents. He was known to be fair and impossible to intimidate. And within a few months, the rougher elements of the Caldwell transient population had developed a healthy respect for him. Walt Decker told Minnie at one point that Caldwell felt different and that he could not quite name the reason, and she said she thought she could, and he nodded as though that confirmed something he had already decided. In February, Minnie told Isaiah that she thought she might be expecting. She told him in the morning at the kitchen table over coffee because she could not think of a more right place for it. He looked at her across the table, and his face went through several things in quick succession: surprise, which gave way to something she could only call wonder, which gave way to a kind of careful, focused joy that was the most Isaiah expression she had ever seen. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said, "but fairly certain." He reached across and took her hand the way he had on the ride home from their wedding. "Are you well?" he asked. "How do you feel?" "I feel fine," she said. "I feel quite good, actually. A little tired in the mornings." "You'll tell me if that changes." "You'll be the first person I tell anything," she said. He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it, and she felt the warmth of it all the way through. She was indeed expecting. The local doctor confirmed it in March, a straightforward and expected pregnancy, no complications anticipated. Dr. Merrill was a competent man who had been practicing on the frontier for 15 years and did not waste time on alarmism. "Keep doing what you're doing," he told Minnie, which was a good prescription for a woman who was constitutionally incapable of doing less. She did not slow down very much. She could not afford to, and she did not particularly want to. The farm still required its daily attention, and the physical work of it suited her better than sitting still. Isaiah adjusted his help around the farm to compensate for what she should not be doing in the later months, and he did it without making her feel managed, which required a considerable amount of tact, and she acknowledged this. Spring came in April with the abrupt enthusiasm of Kansas springs, which did not ease themselves in but arrived all at once, the brown land going green overnight, the sky changing register from the hard gray-white of winter to the soft blue of warming weather. The cottonwoods leafed out along the creek. The pasture came back alive. Minnie planted her kitchen garden with the methodical care she gave to all planting, pressing seeds into the turned earth row by row, and Isaiah helped her on a Sunday, following her instructions about spacing and depth with the same willingness he brought to all tasks he had not done before, without false pride, without pretending to know more than he did, learning as he went. "You're going to be a farmer," she told him, looking at the neat rows he had made. "I appear to be a farmer," he agreed, sitting back on his heels with earth on his hands. "How do you feel about that?" He looked at the garden and then at the pasture and then at her. "I feel like a man who has finally run out of good reasons to be somewhere else," he said. The baby arrived in October of 1883, on a Saturday morning when the cottonwood leaves were turning gold again and the air smelled of fall. A boy. A solid, dark-eyed, thoroughly vocal boy who arrived in the world with the clear intention of making his presence known. Isaiah was there for the birth. Minnie had wanted him there, and he had been there, steady and present and doing whatever was needed, which at one point involved holding her hand with such fierce, concentrated focus that she told him later he had left marks, and he had looked mortified, and she had told him it was the best marks she had ever carried. "He looks like you," Minnie said, looking at the baby later, when the practical business of the birth was concluded and the doctor had gone and the house was quiet and it was just the three of them in the bedroom, the evening light coming soft through the window. "He looks like a baby," Isaiah said. He was holding him with the particular caution of a man who does not yet fully trust himself with something this small, his big hands careful and exact around the small body. He looks extremely small. All babies are small, she said. He will get bigger. Yes, Isaiah said. He was looking at the baby with the same expression she had seen the morning she told him she was expecting, that careful, focused wonder that was his most honest face. Yes, he will. What shall we call him? They had discussed names and not settled on one. Now, looking at the baby, at the dark eyes that were watching the world with brand new seriousness, she waited. Robert, Isaiah said. He looked up at her. If you agree, Robert Isaiah Shelby. Minnie felt the ache and the warmth of it in equal measure flooding through her chest. She had not suggested it because she had not wanted to presume, had not known how Isaiah would feel about the name. But he had gotten there himself, and the fact that he had the generosity of it, the spaciousness of heart it revealed, made her love him in a new way, a deeper fold of the same love, the way a river deepens as it goes. Yes, she said. Robert Isaiah Shelby. Isaiah looked back down at the baby, at Robert, and something settled in his face that she recognized as permanent, the settling of a man who has arrived at his destination and knows it. Walt Decker came the next day and stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the baby with the expression of a man who was not going to cry but was working very hard at it. Robert, he said when Minnie told him the name. Robert Isaiah, she said. Walt pressed his lips together and nodded once. Good name, he said. Good name. He stayed for coffee and made useful noises about the farm, and told Isaiah 3 things that needed doing before winter came, as though the new father required a list of responsibilities to anchor him, and Isaiah wrote them all down with perfect seriousness and thanked him. And Minnie sat in bed with the baby and loved them both immensely. The years that followed were full ones. Isaiah kept his post in Caldwell through the following years, building the kind of steady, respected tenure that changes the character of a town incrementally. The violence went down. The merchant community became more organized. A school board was established in which Minnie served as a founding member. The Shelby homestead expanded. A room added to the house in 1885, a proper barn replacing the old one in 1886. Robert grew from a watchful, serious baby into a watchful, serious small boy who had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness. And the particular combination of those 2 traits produced a child who was simultaneously a great comfort and an enormous challenge. In 1886, their second child arrived. A girl, Margaret, whom they called Meg, a red-cheeked, loudly opinionated baby who grew into a loudly opinionated child, and who Walt Decker declared was the most determined small person he had ever met, which he said with absolute admiration. And in 1888, a third child, a boy they named Thomas, who was gentler than his siblings, easier and more patient, with a gift for the animals that reminded Minnie of Isaiah in those first days when the horses had settled so readily under his hands. The house was full. The farm was good. The pasture had grown to 60 acres with the parcel Minnie had bought from a departing neighbor in 1884. Isaiah rode to Caldwell each morning and came home each evening, and on the evenings when he was home early, he sat on the porch in the last of the light, and watched the land the way she had seen him watch it from the first weeks, with the careful appreciation of a man who understands the value of what he has been given. On an evening in the summer of 1888, when the days were long and golden, and the wheat to the south was ripe, and the children were finally asleep after the enormous effort it always required, Minnie came out to the porch and sat beside Isaiah in the other chair. The prairie was painted in the warm gold and amber of late evening, and the first stars were just beginning to suggest themselves at the eastern horizon. I have been thinking, Isaiah said, without looking away from the sky. A dangerous habit, she said. I have been thinking about the night I came to your door, he said. I have been thinking about it fairly often, actually. What a specific and particular chain of things had to happen, the road agents, the horse throwing me, the fact that I walked in this direction rather than another, the light in your window. You would have found another light, she said. I don't believe that, he said. I believe I would have found my way here or found no way at all. I don't say that poetically. I say it as a man who has thought about probability and circumstance, and I cannot make the math work any other way." Minnie smiled at the horizon. "The badge fell out of your bag," she said. He turned to look at her. The low evening light was on his face, the lines of it familiar and beloved and changed by the year's good changes, the changes that come from living well and working hard and being happy. "I know," he said. "I had been trying to work up to telling you." "I know you had," she said. "I could see it in you." "Were you angry?" "A little," she said honestly. "But mostly I was just relieved, because it explained the things I had been noticing that did not add up, and I do not like things that do not add up." "You would have made a good lawman," he said. "I would have made an excellent lawman," she agreed. He laughed and she laughed with him, and the evening settled around them, warm and permanent and full of the sounds of the farm and the children sleeping in the house behind them and the cattle moving in the pasture and the distant call of a night bird somewhere across the creek. "I was nobody when I came here," he said. "That much was true. I had the badge, but I didn't have this. Any of this. I had the work and the road and the sense that I was doing something useful, which is not nothing, but it is not this." "What is this?" she asked, knowing the answer, wanting to hear it. "Everything," he said, simply, without drama, the way he always said the truest things. "Minnie, this is everything." She reached across the space between their chairs and found his hand. He turned it palm up and laced his fingers through hers, and they sat together on the porch of the house they had built together, in the land that had been hers and was now theirs, while the stars came out over the Kansas prairie one by one, each one steady and particular and very far from nothing. Inside the house, Robert Isaiah Shelby, 5 years old, was apparently not asleep at all, because they could hear the small, deliberate sounds of a child who thinks he is being quiet and is not. Isaiah looked at Minnie with an expression of patient suffering, and she pressed her lips together to contain her smile. "He has your tenacity," Isaiah said. "He has your stubbornness," she said. "We agreed those were the same thing." "We agreed they seemed the same from certain angles," she corrected. He squeezed her hand, and they listened together to their 5-year-old determinedly not sleeping, and the prairie breathed around them in the warm summer dark, and everything that had been open was now closed. Everything that had been homeless had found its home. Everything that had been wounded had healed into something stronger than it had been before the wounding. And the badge, which now hung inside the house on its dedicated peg beside the door, polished and present and entirely accounted for, was just one part of the whole true story of how two people had found each other in the wide and unforgiving and secretly magnificent territory of the American West, and had chosen, out of all the possible destinations, to stay. In the spring of 1889, they planted a new stand of cottonwood saplings along the south fence line, 12 trees in a row, one for each year Minnie had worked this land, and 3 for the children and 2 for the years ahead that were not written yet. Isaiah tamped the earth around the last one with the heel of his boot and stood up straight and looked down the line of small trees, pale green against the darker green of the pasture, and Robert ran the length of the line, touching each one, counting in the loud, confident voice of a child who is proud of knowing numbers. And Meg sat in the grass and pulled it up in fistfuls with absolute focused determination. And Thomas, at 8 months, was on Minnie's hip, watching the trees with his father's dark, serious eyes. "One day," Minnie said, looking down the row, "those will be large trees." "They will," Isaiah said. He came and stood beside her and looked at the small trees and the large sky and the great flat beauty of the land, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side. "We'll be sitting on that porch watching our grandchildren count them." "Grandchildren," she said. "That is an extremely ambitious projection." "I am an extremely ambitious man," he said. "You are a man who walked to my door and claimed to be nobody," she said. "And you," he said, looking down at her with the eyes she had first seen in the lamplight of her front room on a cold September night, "are the woman who looked at a stranger on her porch and decided that was not good enough, that nobody had to be somebody, and did not rest until you found out who. She tipped her head up, and he bent his down and kissed her in the spring morning with the children around them and the small trees in their row and the prairie stretching out in every direction. And it was exactly as it was supposed to be, full and warm and real and entirely, completely home.